They called her the crate girl and laughed whenever she passed through the polished corridors of the forward operating compound. She moved like a shadow between the varnished picnic tables and humming server racks, shouldered the Barrett rifle as if it were a crate of rations, smiled as if the world had not mouthed a verdict about her worth. Her hair was bound in a plain knot, her uniform a threadbare substitute for the crisp, tailored gear of the unit's elite. She smelled faintly of oil and tea. People who were used to being seen did not notice people who did not expect to be seen. They thought she was small, literal, incidental. That assumption became the habit they used to justify jokes and bets, and a kind of institutionalized contempt that always hung at the edge of things and waited politely until some event made it easy for everyone to join in. The compound had a scent of jet fuel and ambition. Hangar lights threw long bars of glare across polished firing lanes. The leaders in the office suites had faces with the same expression, a tilt of mouth that asked the world to acknowledge them first. They had the advantages of reputation and rhetoric. They had a man named Kersey who had won 3 national challenges and a permanent place in the mess hall's mythology. Kersey could draw a crowd with a single story about a 4,100-meter miss that had somehow become a legend of its own. The coterie clustered around his table like moths, eager to be warmed by reflected glory. They had contracts, endorsements, and the authoritative way men have when they believe their myth is the only map the rest of the world needs. The woman, no one used her first name unless they had to, handled the rifle with an ease that made the carrying of it a kind of choreography. The rifle was heavy and bulky the way a history is heavy when it is older than the people who talk about it. Its paint was scuffed and pitted. A faded name was stamped along the receiver, almost illegible from the years of being handled. Meridian. The weapon had a history that didn't belong to anyone present in the lit corridors. It belonged to a time of whispered operations and impossible shots, to a unit that had been erased from official roll calls and folded into myth. To the men at Kersey's table, it was a prop for their jokes. To the woman, it was a worn badge of inheritance. She was outwardly plain. Her boots were scuffed, her gloves had mended seams, and a gaggle of junior soldiers who phoned in their complaints about the weather and the schedule called her Crate Girl because it was quicker than her surname. They said she only existed to lug weight, to be the visible but inert muscle that made object lessons for training videos. They said she could not be called to the shooting line because she had no pedigree. They said she wasn't in the right unit. They said all of it loud enough that the words took on a shape, and in that shape became a campaign. She listened. She kept her eyes on the tasks in front of her. When sarcasm aimed at her like a thrown rock, she ducked and returned to work. She wiped brass, counted rounds, tuned optics with the focus of someone who had spent hours doing the same small motion until it became the only way to stop the world from going soft at the edges. If anyone had asked why she persisted with a rifle that had caused men in uniform to exchange superstitious glances, she might have said, simply, he left it to his daughter. She never said it. She did not have the energy to be explainable to people who preferred their narratives crisp and programmable. She kept and maintained the weapon because its presence needed a guardian, because the rifle had known things and needed someone to remember the weight of them. The compound's rituals were public in ways the woman sometimes forgot. New recruits arrived to be evaluated. Corporations and donors sent guests who wanted to watch the newest hardware in action. The media wanted spectacles, not the scrape of wrenches or the fine-tuned patience that made a sighting true. The best public theater, invariably, involved a contest. Kersey loved contests because they let him speak in the shaker-smooth voice of authority. A man who could stage a spectacle could convert scorn to currency. He liked to put bets on his table and call for sides. The coterie laughed. They called the woman the Crate Girl and patted the Barrett stock as if it were a joke they had already told to themselves. When the day came that would unravel the coterie's assumptions, it began like any other bright, low-humidity morning. The firing line was set for a demonstration sponsored by visiting officers, a field trip that would double as recruiting theater. Banners hung like the final punctuation on a sentence everyone thought they understood. The schedule was printed and distributed like a neat argument that refused footnotes. The woman had been listed as logistics. She would set up the firing lanes, calibrate the clocks, check the ranges. No one expected her to use the Barrett. No one expected more than the customary clatter of dismissive commentary. They began early, over coffee and bold declarations. Kersey told a story about a man who'd made an impossible miss and then turned it into a legend. He told it with the surety of a person who had invested heavily in being right. His friends snickered and placed bets. A few younger soldiers dared to say things that were not yet full instructions, but smelled like them. She could trip while carrying that thing and take out a range post. Someone said, the joke catching like a thrown match. Another voice, we should film it. Comedy gold. Phones came out and hands hovered over record buttons. The woman moved through this like a wind around trees. It did not change her. She kept one hand on her instrument and the other on the small notebook she carried. A list of serial numbers, targets, and maintenance notes in a handwriting that did not beg for pity or applause. At noon, the visiting group gathered and the procession of exercises began. Targets snapped up and fell. There were claps, nods of approval, the mild flattery of men who liked to see things performed in front of them. The woman checked a scope, adjusted a mount. She was methodical in ways that people confused for timidity. The coterie made commentary that alternated between contempt and mock concern. They called her gently enough that it struck like the touch of a cane. The first taunt came from a captain in the visiting party, an angular man who liked to turn sentences into barbs. Is she here to help carry? He asked, loud enough for the assembled to hear. They laughed. He pointed to the Barrett. That rifle must be a museum piece. You usually need a team to haul that thing. Maybe 2 teams, the woman did not answer. She adjusted an elevation knob with the practiced fluidity of someone who had made mechanical patience an art. Her silence worked like a stone in a slow stream. The water found its way around. Then, someone decided to film. The pocket phone was raised by a recruit who thought a viral moment would be an elegant service to his rank. They made bets, invented captions, and the coterie started a chant that was only half a joke. Crate girl, they sang, part mockery and part a ritual that kept the group together in the act of exclusion. The chant drew other comments, and then a ripple of laughter. The woman continued to do her work as if the world were operating on a different vibration that she was tuned to. Her hands found the site's fine threads. Her fingers smelled of grease and resolve. And then the corrupt gatekeeper acted. He was the safety officer, a man with a clipboard who had perfected the art of authority that became petty when it could not be robust. His name was Latham. He had a face that folded into confessions when challenged. Latham declared, loudly and without prelude, that the Barrett's ammunition looked suspiciously like a hazard. He insisted they count the rounds again. He waved his clipboard, conjuring regulations like a priest waving incense. The men gathered around with an eagerness that had been primed by the earlier mockery. Hazard protocol, Latham said. We must ensure there is no risk. Latham's actions were surgical. While the crowd's attention was devoted to his grandstand, his subordinates moved with the kind of precision that comes from practice in small cruelties. The woman's custom ammo, rounds that had been hand-checked and tagged by her hours ago, rounds that were suited to the peculiar temper of the weapon and the reach she knew in her bones, were scattered like corn on a threshing floor. Some were misplaced. Others were lodged in boxes marked for disposal. Timing was a weapon that day. The safety officer's inspection became a cover for a sabotage that would not require overt malice to have devastating effect. The Barrett's magazine clattered down on a floor tile like a small surrender. She watched with the quiet of someone who recognized the disruption for what it was. Her eyes did not flare. There was no shout. Her hands were steady as she bent and recovered the rounds. When she rose, someone in the coterie grinned and said, See? Hazard. We told you a few hands filmed. Bet amounts were raised in the same breath as jokes were clapped on. The woman did not let the camera see her face. She put the rounds back in order and smoothed out the magazine spring with a thumb that had learned maintenance as an answer to the world. The sabotage had a second effect. Latham used the incident to limit her time on the firing line, citing safety and fairness. Logistics do not get unlimited lane time, he said, as if reading a rule intended specifically to exclude a person who had a legacy printed on a rifle's receiver. Kersey raised an eyebrow of congenial cruelty. Better to put someone with the right unit on this, he suggested. Give them a chance to show what this rifle can do. The coterie laughed, and the chant resumed. Only now it had the feeling of a ritual dance to a Shriner's band. The woman stood back. She watched new shooters slide their own optics into place and call for an extended range. They were polished, their breaths quick and proud. They took shots at targets that were routine, even banal, proving nothing and all the things the audience liked to see. Phones recorded. The compound's official photographer took angles that made everyone look like they belonged to a photograph's best lighting. The woman adjusted the Barrett's bipod with patient hands. There was a history behind the scratches on the stock. The name Meridian had been hand-stamped in a time when names mattered as currency. She had never told anyone who knew the unit. She had not had the appetite to correct fools. The acceptance she carried was not resignation. It was an obscured readiness. She could wait. She also had a plan. There were cartridges in her pack, tucked away in a leather roll that had been mended more times than any of the men had patched a shirt. They were custom, not the standard issue rounds the compound trusted by rote and habit. They were tuned for long-range stability and were the result of a painstaking relationship between tool and hand. She had measured and remeasured the spacing of rifling and projectile weight in her head the way other people recited scripture. She could feel the infinitesimal difference that made an 80% chance become a certainty when everything aligned. Calm wind, true sight, and a shooter who could translate a whisper of physics into a single, muscular moment. The first humiliation had been public and repeated. Daily, more insults threaded into the mesh of the compound's life. Someone posted a mocking photo of her on the internal feed, the Barrett slung across her shoulders with a caption that treated the weapon like a cartoon. There were bets on the likelihood of her breaking the rifle within a week. Men mockingly offered to help her carry. In the mess hall, they took to singing the chant that had been born at the firing lanes. The woman ate alone, mechanically. Her food was strong and plain. She tasted salt and remembered what had told him years ago when he had given her the rifle. Learn where the world hides the distances. She had learned to listen to the whisper at the edge of the known. She had a reputation in other circles, half-remembered whispers that did not belong on the compound's polished floors. Old soldiers who had not been to this base would sometimes nod toward her in a way that was almost a private recognition. A retired instructor, when he first met her, had said nothing but had given her a look that acknowledged a veteran in waiting. Those gestures were not proof in the compound's ledger, but they were anchors in the woman's life. She kept them close. They were like soft practice in a rehearsal room where the only audience were a few chairs and a window that let in a small slant of light. The incident that set the turning point in motion was sharper than a general complaint. Kersey, drunk on the idea of spectacle, proposed a public challenge, a trial meant to prove, conclusively, who deserved the right to be seen on the firing line. "We will set the farthest target," he said, voice loud and cocky. 3,200 meters. An official demonstration. We will film it. Whoever makes that shot deserves the stage. The visiting officers smiled because they loved numbers and spectacle. The coterie cheered and imagined themselves cast in the foreground of a viral film. Latham smiled his institutional smile and processed the necessary forms. He could be petty and still be official. He signed off with the dry pen of a man content with his place in a machine. The woman's name was not on the official lineup. That was obvious. Kersey's smirk widened as he imagined the tickets for the moment. People took bets. A tally of shame was created. It became a paper altar for the compound's cruelty. The woman watched as the target list was posted and felt the small, steady ignition of something that had lain dormant. She was provoked, not by a single insult, but the accumulation of days of small humiliations. She could have chosen the hum of retreat. Instead, she began to prepare as if she were a mercantile shipstead loading for a voyage everyone else called impossible. Her decision to step forward was not the loud victory Kersey and his followers expected. There was no shout, no saluting her own ego in public. She walked to the range officer and asked for a time slot. Her voice was low, factual. "I want a lane," she said. The lane allocator glanced over and said, "We aren't giving line time to logistics." Latham's safety protocol was cited. Kersey laughed. One of the junior soldiers called out the chant. The woman's reply was as simple as a truth. "Give me a lane," she said again. It was a sentence with weight, but no show of malice. Her request was a stone dropped in shallow water. The ripple spread. Latham, in a show of petty authority, told her she could have a lane only if she used standard-issue ammo and if her magazine passed inspection. The rules were created to box her out. They were also flexible in the way fences are flexible for those who insist on bending them. She agreed to the constraints and accepted the time slot that had been issued grudgingly. Kersey's face registered a fragile triumph. A circus had arrived in which he would be the ringmaster and the laughingstock. On the day of the trial, the compound had an air of expectation. The distant mountains cut the sky into a pale, flaring edge. Wind instruments were placed. Meteorological officers took readings with the kind of seriousness people reserve for funerals. Eyes were measured and pride was weighed. The coterie arrived early and took seats in the front row, their posture like a barricade. Phones were placed on rests. The visiting officer had a press kit. The target at 3,200 meters was small in the landscape, a distant punctuation on the horizon, a white rectangle that might as well have been a pebble. The distance itself had become a theater piece, an arithmetic truth that could be turned into either glory or humiliation. She made one small, symbolic gesture before the trial started. She cleaned the barrel slowly, with the kind of care that was almost a meditation. Other shooters only glanced toward the barrel and trusted the mechanical assumption. She treated it like a liturgy. The name Meridian had a scrape near the receiver that she traced with a thumb, a gesture both reverent and private. The name had been the subject of jokes, a unit erased from rosters and remade in tavern tales. To the men who mocked her, Meridian was a punchline. To her, it was a lineage. The symbol that had been scoffed at for so long was now a talisman tucked against her palm. Then the corvette of small permissions began dismantling itself. Latham, who had resisted her every request, took one final step toward blatant sabotage. He claimed a hazard again, this time declaring the custom ammo she had tucked away in her leather roll and unapproved batch. "You bring non-standard munitions onto the compound. You break protocol," he said, sealing words with a disdainful nod. He tore open the leather and spread the rounds, judging them by the sheen of institutional suspicion. The coterie bristled with delight. The filaments of their amusement were electric. Someone whispered that they would film the confiscation, post it as proof of the girl's inadequate preparation. Latham placed the rounds under a clear plastic sea of condemnations. He told the assembly they would not allow non-standard rounds. The crowd murmured their agreement. The woman's options narrowed. The Barrett's custom rounds were precisely what the rifle needed to reach beyond what standard methods permitted. They had a slightly heavier projectile and a polymer tip designed to stabilize at long ranges. She had spent private hours calibrating those notes, like a musician practicing until a hand could play impossible intervals without thinking. If the rounds could not be used, the shot would be left to the cheap arithmetic of pride. Kersey would walk home with a new story. The coterie would tweet and cheer. The woman watched as the assembled judges of her fate turned the odds her way. And then she made a choice that stunned everyone steeped in certainty. She did not argue. She did not shout. She performed a small, exacting ritual. With hands that had never trembled in a crucial moment, she took the rounds Latham had condemned and slipped them back into a roll she had stitched beneath the barrel. She closed that hidden seam with pressure that meant resolve. She looked at Latham without pleading and without triumph. "This rifle is calibrated for those rounds," she said, the statement a factual anchor. The coterie laughed. Kersey said, "We'll get a good laugh in the archives now." The timing was perfect. Her statement came before the engagement, before the audience had itself set the cues for imperial laughter. She moved then, putting on ear protection, visors, and the habit of someone who was about to translate practice into a single action. The lane officer studied his clipboard. He wanted to find some rule against what she had done. The visiting officer's pen paused. The press might prefer theatrics to the subtleties of procedure, but even spectacle can be unaccountable. The woman stepped into position. Her face did not show call-outs. She had long practiced the art of being unnoticed, of letting a single moment speak for everything she had not spoken. The crowd waited like a hell breath. The coterie adopted postures of patronizing expectation. The recruits with phones pointed them like instruments of judgment. The distance between the rifle's muzzle and the target was a sentence with a lot of syllables. She made no display of technicality. She set the bipod and settled in. She found the sight picture and let her body find the sense of alignment that runs deeper than sight. She watched the crosshair move as the wind teased the grass, and the sun slid in a way that made colors thicken. Her breathing regulated not as a heroic pose, but as an instrument of calculation. She was aware, in that concentrated moment, of a few things that were not loud. The first was the small cadence of her heartbeat, a metronome that had cataloged long practice. The second was the weather, 3 degrees of left spin high and a steady, dry gust at an occasional interval. The compound's meteorologist called it 8B breeze, dismissive at first glance, but lethal to trajectories at long distances. The third was the discipline of time. Each breath had a price in microangles and drift. She counted none of these aloud. She translated them into adjustments in the dial, the shim of a sight. The action was arithmetic made human, degrees, clicks, second-order corrections. Preparation had been worship in a small room with no audience for a long time. She remembered a line he had once said, a man who had folded himself into her history like a necessary preface. They teach you to be invisible. You learn to be quiet. But remember, invisibility becomes dangerous when you have to do the impossible with it. She thought of those words for a heartbeat, and then she dropped them into a pocket labeled for private use. She did not need rhetoric. She had data. She adjusted the scope's parallax, checked the wind flags, and then, for a singular and decisive second, breathed. They called for the shot. Kersey, certain of victory, applauded in that brittle way that is both performance and anxiety. The coterie chanted in a murmur. Phones recorded and the compound's official camera rolled, trained and steady. The woman squeezed the trigger. The recoil was a language the barrel spoke in. It was the briefest of conversations between metal and human bone. The rifles but kissed her shoulder and then pushed away. The projectile left with a whisper that vanished into the plains. The crowd's laughter hung on the exact fraction of a second where nothing happened. Then a long, hungry silence filled the space. Binoculars turned to find the target. The conventional expectation, fed by years of small humiliations, held that the shot would not reach true. Stories already prepared themselves in the mouths of men who loved to recount failure as a kind of entertainment. A human being cannot tell a distance's story without a few seconds. Small groups in the coterie looked at each other and mouthed either derision or preemptive victory. The recruits moved their cameras like larvae see a sun. But then the target, that white rectangle so far away it had seemed a place not within common imagination, buckled. It went down with the peculiar, discrete movement of a propelled mechanism having received an unexpected and irreversible instruction. The plume of dust where the round had impacted a support caught the sun and hung there like a splattered comma. Silence swelled into a vacuum of surprise. Kersey's jaw slackened. The coterie ceased in mid-cheer and then, like an organism realizing a misstep, went quiet. Phones were still. Their screens recorded a moment that none of the takers had believed would happen. The visiting officers stared and then turned their faces toward the woman as if someone had rearranged the set while the play was going. Latham's clipboard dropped from his hand with a sound like a defeated percussion. For one disorientating second, the topography of authority in the compound was unmade. The reaction was not immediate. In scenes of disbelief, people often choose to be noisy before they become sensible. That day, noise came first as a reflex of shock. Someone laughed, a high, instinctive noise that did not match the weather. Then silence returned like a tide. Faces burned red with embarrassment. A few of the coterie grinned in that brittle way that means someone seeking a joke to return the world to its comfortable shape. The crowd shifted. A veteran in the back, a man who had seen long ranges and quiet victories before honors were printed in public schedules, took off his hat and gave a small, crisp salute without words. The salute was an admission that someone had performed in a way the institution now had to recognize. She did not rise to applause. She did not laugh. She took off the ear protection and put the rifle on its bipod again, already shifting to the work of tracking the possibility for a follow-up. Her face was neutral. Only the smallest lines around her eyes moved, the evidence of focus more than of pleasure. The victory had arrived, but it did not change her internal austerity. Her victory was not a place on which to build a new story of herself in public. It was a pause where she could fold another action into the history she kept inside a pocket. Kersey tried to take command of the aftermath. He walked toward her with a politician's grin. A man who believes his narrative must keep going because silence embarrasses him more than truth. Lucky shot, he said, the sentence meant as dismissal, but offered with a false comradely tone. The woman looked at him. She did not insult him. She could have corrected that entire world assumptions by saying the name of the unit printed on the rifle and then watching men's faces do the work of recognition. Instead, she spoke a sentence that had the quiet and the force of a judgment. 2 clicks left, she said. It was a factual note, almost a technical addendum. It had the effect of a single, clean blade. Kersey's face registered confusion and then a small panic before it rearranged itself into a mask. The coterie shifted like a flock. Latham, whose act of sabotage had been the hinge that set this theater aside, looked as if the ground had given way. He tried to organize a response. "We will check the log," he said, the bureaucratic replay of denial. A visiting officer stepped forward, a man whose authority carried weight and whose experience had taught him when to make a public gesture or a private one. He moved with a slow deliberation and stood a respectful distance from the woman. He removed his hat and then nodded. Not a salute, not an announcement, a nod that meant something like recognition without spectacle. A murmur moved through the crowd like a wind that knew the names of the stars only slightly better than the men elbowing for purchase in the sun. Someone whispered, "Meridian." The words circulated and gathered the kind of slow heat old words have when they resurrect buried things. It was half expected and wholly shocking. The name had been a myth, a soft story people told when they'd had too much to drink. Here, in the bright, clean light of the compound's sponsored field day, it was a truth hatched into the open. The respectful authority stepped closer and did something even Kersey could not manage publicly. He offered a crisp salute, the kind reserved for recognition that could not be packaged as mere formality. The gesture settled over the day like winter over a field. It stuck. The veteran's eyes were dry, but his mind was steady. He had been present earlier in life when a cadre had been called Meridian. He had known men who carried legend in their spines. That badge had been erased from official lists, but not from the private ledger of old soldiers. The salute retethered a history the compound had tried to keep as a footnote. The crowd shifted its narrative. Phones no longer recorded with a tone of mockery, but with the careful hunger of people capturing a conversion. The coterie had to reconcile its chosen story with the proof. A few tried to cling to denials like a kind of last-stage pride. Kersey said, too quickly, an odd gust. Hit a sliver. The technical explanation was small wings on a bigger and more stubborn truth. The visiting officer's hand rested on the barrel for half a second, a small knowing touch that was almost a benediction. He said, simply, "You knew this rifle." The skeptic turned ally had been a lieutenant who had publicly signed the betting pool earlier, but had watched closely and would not let tribal pride obscure a fact. He approached with a technical curiosity and asked for the rifle 0 and the environmental readouts. He poked at the mechanics the way a scientist tests a specimen. Under his fingers, some of the mystery resolved into technique. He admitted aloud that the shot required not only a rare weapon, but a shooter who could read the world like a map of arranged friction. "I've seen adjustments," he said, a phrase that tasted like admission. He had been skeptical. Now he became witness. The corrupt gatekeeper's collapse was not a melodrama. It was quiet and brutal. Latham's face turned pale first, and then flushed in a way that suggested the hand of shame. He tried to point at paperwork, to recite protocols that might validate his sabotage as an act of civic duty. The pen in his hand was suddenly valueless because the moral ledger had been rewritten in public. Men who had been only minor players became minor players with the added burden of being on the wrong side of a photo. Some of them would later adjust their resumes. Others would not survive the compound's internal reputational economy. The consequences filtered away from a single day like ripples in a pond. The immediate aftermath required only a little public tending. The visiting press wanted a statement. The official camera wanted angles that could be issued across social channels. The woman declined offers to pose. She allowed a few photographs to be taken, but she did so at the edges, never at the center. She answered a single, necessary question from the visiting officer about her training history in a voice that did not need to be triumphant and never was. She did not give interviews. She sat down afterward in the mess hall and ate quietly, as if the world had not been rearranged by an action that was, to her, nothing more than the alignment of practice. Word spread beyond the base like a fever line on radio waves. People who followed competitions and archives began to speak the name Meridian as if it had been dormant in their mouths, waiting. The compound's internal network filled up with posts that oscillated between ridicule and admission. There were retractions and apologies that sounded like they had been written more by committee than by remorse. Some of the coterie found themselves without invitations to aught functions. Sponsors who had been courting the men at Kersey's table calculated the exposure and decided, privately, that their association with mockery might be a liability. There was also a tangible effect in policy. The higher-ups could not ignore a clean, undeniable projectile hitting a distant target in the court of public opinion that followed. Internal rules about safety officer discretion were revised in a way no one at the time attributed to a single person or action. A clause was inserted about equitable access to firing time and about the process by which ammunition could be inspected and condemned. The bureaucratization of fairness is not a poetic thing, but it is a useful one. It meant Latham's power to unmake people became less absolute. That kind of consequence is slow but durable. It is the difference between someone being humiliated once in public and the system that permitted it being corrected. The heroine of the story, the woman who had been the crate girl, did not bask in accolades. She refused medals that would have turned a private truth into a stage prop. She insisted on continuing to do the work that made her useful in the way she always had. She trained quietly and then took on a handful of students who had been overlooked or underestimated. A lanky recruit who had trouble reading range tables, a young woman who had difficulty with recoil, a boy with a stammer and hands that needed guidance. She taught them how to find the hidden arithmetic of long-range shooting and how to treat their tools like living things. She taught them the habit of listening for the wind. She did not try to make them into a spectacle. She taught them to be invincible in small ways, to avoid being surprised by the world that thought them minor. There was one student who became a symbol of the story's aftertaste. He was nervous and shy, a corporal who had once snuck into the compound late to listen to men tell their jokes. After the demonstration, he found the woman and asked, haltingly, for instruction. He had been part of the coterie in the easy way people are part of clubs when they are younger. He wanted to unlearn his practice of derision. She accepted him as she accepted others, with technical rigor and without spectacle. She made him scrub brass until his fingers learned the geometry of a cartridge. She corrected his stance and taught his eye to read small shifts across a horizon. He became one of the humble followers, the kind who carries the story forward not as a trophy, but as a quiet obligation. Time altered the shapes of the antagonist's lives in different ways. Kersey's star dimmed. A sponsor withdrew their endorsement after a candid news piece showed his quickness to mock someone his peers had underestimated. That retraction, while financial, carried a symbolic price. He could still be a leader in words, but his voice lost some of its authority in the compound. Latham was reassigned to administrative duties in a remote branch, where paper could not bruise anyone else's performance in public. The coterie fractured and then reformed in smaller groups, shyer about their jokes. Some of them came to training under the guise of curiosity and fell into the humility of practice. The woman's legacy became a quiet mythology. People who had once laughed at her told the story later in a softened voice when new recruits arrived, as a kind of cautionary tale. Do not mock what you do not know. The Meridian rifle was placed in a display case in a training hall months later. A small plaque added that spoke about a demonstration and a shooter who had unmade a myth. The plaque used official language, which meant it turned a human story into language that fit into pamphlets and HR memos. The transformation is not surprising. Institutions prefer their heroes be neat and framed. The woman did not mind. The rifle's presence in public was a small victory for quiet things. She continued to live in the edges of the compound's social map. People who wanted to see the woman now came to ask for private instruction rather than for the spectacle of a public victory. They were men and women who had been underestimated by other reasons: class, gender, or the gentle cruelty of a world that prefers bold narratives. She taught them, as she had taught the corporal, not merely how to hit targets at insane ranges, but how to be patient with the world. She taught them the short, declarative sentences that had been an inner monologue in her most secret moments. They think they can break me. They'll learn. She taught them practical things like how to adjust for ballistic drop, how to tune a barrel until the whispers stopped, and how to read a wind flag in 3 seconds. The story gathered new accretions. A visiting journalist wrote a profile, not as a profile, but as a small, human vignette, and in that piece the woman was described as the hidden legend, a phrase that fit her like a glove and pinched in the most delicate places. Young women who had never expected access to the shooting line wrote letters and sent photographs of their own practice. They thanked her for a reality she did not intend to give, a possibility that being unseen did not mean being unable. She responded to some letters in short notes, and to others with no response. She had learned over time that attention is jewelry. You should wear only the pieces you like. She had a friend in the respectful authority, a retired instructor who took no pleasure in spectacle but kept a careful watch on people who deserved better. He found ways to hollow out time for her to teach and to exchange technical details the way other men traded small conspiracies. They did not speak of past action much. He understood that the woman had a private ledger of grief and honor, and that public praise could not be poured into that ledger like coin. He recognized that the proof of a life was not a speech, but the way a small room filled with quiet learners learned to hold a rifle without fear, or with only the small kind of fear that makes practice clean and severe. The woman refused to be turned into a mascot. She turned down an offer to front a charity that wanted to trade her story for donations and advertisements. She resisted becoming a palimpsest of other people's needs. She wanted the work itself. She wanted the long hours and the smell of oil and the precision of numbers. She wanted, above all, that the rifle be treated as what it was, a tool with a lineage and no more than the attention it deserved. The quietness of herself, which had once been mistaken for weakness, became, in men's minds, a kind of ideological problem. They tried to quantify her silence as arrogant or dismissive and found it did not fit their categories. A few years after the demonstration, the compound held a small ceremony not for her, but for a group of recruits who had excelled in training. She was invited as a private guest. They placed a small plaque near the display with a Meridian rifle. She stood in the back and watched young faces listen for the kind of instruction that is hard to craft on demand. A boy with flinty eyes who had once bet against her found her afterwards and said, awkwardly, "I owe you an apology." Her reaction was simple and suited to the woman she had been through thick days and thin nights. "Keep your aim," she said. The sentence was a phrase that contained more than the words. It was an ethic. There were moments of temptation. The fame that had arrived with the one perfect shot could have been a ladder. There were speaking offers, documentary approaches, people who wanted to build narratives with her at the center. She refused all but one, an invitation to open a small range for underprivileged youths. She accepted the only offer that would let her practice her values, a place where quiet people could learn without an audience of giggling men judging them for their hair ties or their glove size. It was a place without trophies and without corporate banners. It was a place with benches and a steady supply of tea. That was how the woman became a quiet mentor. She taught with fury and patience. She taught people to keep language precise. She taught them short internal truths whispered in moments of doubt. Laugh now. You won't soon. She taught them how to recognize sabotage and how institutions sometimes try to fold people into the corners. She taught them how to live with a rifle and not let it live with them. The students carried their knowledge out into different worlds, into police forces, into hunting clubs, into private competitions, and they did the slow work of changing the settings that had hurt them. They often credited her not in public pages, but in notes that said, simply, "You changed my aim." The old antagonist found new marginalities. Kersey moved on to a consulting job and found himself pitching to audiences who valued measurement over myth. He could still tell stories. He had fewer believers. Latham's career limped and then withered. The coteries members learned to be quieter. Some of them, in private, came back and asked for instruction in the very way their younger selves had laughed at her. The woman gave it to them without malice. To teach someone who had once mocked you requires a small kind of charity or perhaps a strategy. Either way, she had the capacity to extend her knowledge without asking for apologies in equal currency. Her principle was simple. Skill is more convincing than recrimination. In the years that followed the shot, the story of the 3,200-meter round acquired the small patina of legend that happens without deliberate intention. People recounted it in training halls and in bars, not because they wanted to shirt front an enemy, but because it had the moral economy of a good story. Someone low in the hierarchy did extraordinary work and, in doing so, caused the hierarchical world to rearrange itself. The lesson was not only that the woman had been vindicated, but that institutions could be reshaped by the mere insistence of one person to be counted. Yet the most striking outcome was quieter still. The students she trained, the humble follower who became competent, and the skeptical lieutenant who turned into an ally, began to mentor others. The compound's culture shifted not by mandate, but by small, accumulative acts of practice. The chant of mockery lost its rhythm. New rituals replaced old ones. People began to say each other by name with a little more care. Those are the small changes that add up over time. They're not showy, but they endure with an obstinate strength. Sometimes she would stand at the edge of the training field and watch a group of novices set up a site or adjust a bipod. She would not always speak. She would simply watch like someone who kept accounts. She knew exactly how often the vibration of a setting sun could change a wind's direction. She knew what it meant to be underestimated because she had spent years being invisible in a certain economy. But invisibility, she had discovered, could be a crucible for a kind of unannounced greatness. It allowed a person to practice until a single moment could become a thunderclap. On one autumn day, a plaque was attached to the larger training hall, the institution's public face. It did not name her directly in the headline. It read of a demonstration that had changed policy and culture. People noticed and read, and then smiled at what the official language had suited into the thing. A young trainee stood beside her and read the plaque aloud, and then looked up with those bright, naive eyes. "Where are you watching from?" he asked, a question both about geography and about identity. She smiled, small and contained, and answered in a voice that held no need for thunder. "From the edge," she said. The trainee nodded as if he understood the meaning of an edge, though he would only learn it through practice. There were moments when the old inner monologue surfaced, and she allowed herself the faint pleasure of remembering the day the target buckled. She kept the memory like a stone for warming by in cold weather. She lifted it in private and thought, "I didn't come to win. I came to show them who I am." Those words were never meant to be shouted. They were meant to be the truthful engine of decisions. She had succeeded in a way that antagonists did not expect, not by flaming their reputations, but by quietly dismantling them through proof. People who had the urge to make heroes wanted to frame her with trophies. She avoided such cages. Her victory was not properly an ending and not properly a means. It was a reconfiguration of the field and of how the field assigned value. That kind of triumph is inconsistently received in cultures that prefer their stories to be neat. She accepted this and returned to her work. She taught a student who once had enough courage to apologize. She taught one who had never been given a rifle without a laugh. She taught a lieutenant who had changed his mind. The compound's future was shaped in small, steady episodes by these students who would carry on the unheralded work. The woman aged as anyone does who lives a life of small rituals and continual repair. Her hands developed a map of scars and calluses that told nothing public about the depth of her work, but were legible to the students she trained. She kept the Barrett not as a shrine, but as an instrument. It was polished, kept in repair, and used in practice when she deemed it appropriate. When she finally decided to add a small plaque beside Meridian's display, she wrote nothing grand. She placed only the dates and the unit's careful notation in a small line, for those who learned to listen. When younger recruits asked whether she regretted the years of being underestimated, she would sometimes answer with a question of her own. "Do you know how often people make mistakes when they assume?" she would ask. They did not. Her purpose was not to deliver lectures, but to seed skills. She wanted them to learn by doing. She wanted the institutions to correct themselves through the practice of ordinary people. That was her quiet revolution. In the end, the compound became a slightly better place for the marginalized simply because a single undeniable act had forced a bureaucratic and social reexamination. The arrogant king lost his untouchable sheen. The coterie of mockers had to reckon with the fact that loyalty to one person's myth did not make them infallible. The corrupt gatekeeper learned that petty sabotage could be corrected by a public proof too clean to be denied. Those shifts were not only punitive but instructive. On a crisp morning many years later, the woman walked the training field with a small band of apprentices around her. They practiced under her patient, precise supervision. A boy who had once snickered now measured wind and adjusted accordingly. A girl balanced the Barrett and read the distance, and then smiled when her group made a clean shot at a target that was far but not unfathomable. The air smelled of oil and a little of victory. It was a domestic scent. The triumph of the big shot had not become a spectacle that refused to be ordinary. She had become a mentor who moved the needle of culture by simple insistence that competence deserve a hearing and that mockery be met not with fire, but with a single, undeniable demonstration. People who came after her told the story of the crate girl who was invisible and then, with a single shot, remade what was possible. They learned that vindication can be quiet, and that the moral arc of accountability sometimes bends on small, human actions. Sometimes in the quiet between drills, she would take out the Barrett and feel its weight and the old name stamped on it. She would rub her thumb where Meridian had once been stamped and think of those who had loved her at a glance, and those who had mocked her at every glance. She kept the rifle clean because it was not only a tool, but a story that had been entrusted to her hands. She had been burdened with it in a world that likes tidy stories of glory and wanted nothing to do with anyone who might complicate their comfortable narratives. The target that had fallen at 3,200 meters remained a moment and a lesson. The people who had looked on and laughed learned, in various ways and at varying paces, that being underestimated was not irreversible. They learned that the institutional power to define someone could be contested by a person who chose action over noise. They learned that a woman who was outwardly unremarkable in a world that prized the luminary could be an anchor for a change the organization had not scheduled. If anyone asked the woman whether she wanted to be remembered, she would answer with her usual economy, not with a speech, but with a brief directive. "Teach," she would say. That was the whole of it. Her life was not about a record, but about the people who carried on what she had taught them. Her single shot at 3,200 meters became a pivot point. It was the kind of proof that splinters arrogance and rebuilds patience. It was the moment a quiet person claimed not spectacle, but rightful place. It was a vindication not framed by noise, but by precision, and the compound, and the people who inhabited it eventually learned to keep their distance from cheap laughter. Years after the event, the students who had grown under her guidance scattered into the world and carried the quiet lesson with them. Some refused to repeat the mockery they had once been part of. Others built training programs that emphasized equity and not spectacle. The institution itself adjusted in small but crucial ways. Policies changed. Lives were redirected. The ripple of one precise act expanded into a culture of more than a few degrees of decent treatment. It was not perfect. No system ever is. But it was better. She remained the woman who preferred to live at the edges. She kept the rifle and the memory and the small band of apprentices, and she taught them until the day the residue of her own history felt like the past and not the present. She watched as the barricades of arrogance shifted, and when asked later why she had responded to the provocation at all, she gave the same quiet answer she had always offered through action. Someone had to show them what it meant to be wrong, she said. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of repair. And so the story hung on the lip of the compound's long seasons. It was told in various clothes, as an anecdote in a new recruit's induction, as a lesson in a veteran's private memory, and as a quiet, private pride in the woman who had become a mentor. The shot that struck a target at 3,200 meters turned into a resonant proof of the truth that talent and discipline do not require the loudness of announcement to be real. The woman had been underestimated. She had not been broken. She had demonstrated, with an unadorned finality, that the world was wrong to have thought so. In the end, when she was old enough to be afforded the label of legend without offense, gravestones and plaques and histories would find their ways to her story and seat it politely in the pages that catalog human performance. But those official recountings were secondary to the things that mattered to her. The students who adjusted their sights on the cheap wind and found a target and a future waiting. She remained stoic, understated, and absolutely competent. Her vindication was not for the applause. It was the quiet of people who could now carry on their lives with a different kind of dignity. Once, the visiting journalist who had written the sympathetic profile returned to the compound and asked if the woman would stand for a formal photograph. She agreed on one condition, that one of her students be in the frame. The photograph was taken without fanfare. It was not glamorous. The woman and the pupil stood beside Meridian, hands on the barrel, as if touching the history it contained. The picture was printed and later pinned in the training room. People who had once laughed would stand before it and feel a small and private shame, and some of them would do the right thing after that shame. Encourage, teach, and resist the urge to mock. There was a last quiet detail to this story that the plaque and programs did not know how to encode. When she was dying, old in a way that required no drama, she lay in a room with a few photographs on the wall and the Barrett, as if a guardian had set it there as an offering. A former student came with tea in a hand that had learned to steady before a shot. They spoke about wind and about habit and about small things only a shooter would value. She smiled and said, as she had often said in other moments of private mettle, "You don't need to be loud to be strong." Then she closed her eyes, unclenched and at peace in a life that had started in anonymity and ended as a quiet anchor for others. The students who sat with her later would say that in her silence lived a kind of full-throated truth. The rifle was heavy with memory, but it was not a burden. It was a passed-on responsibility. The compound continued to thrum and to change. Young people came who had never heard the chant and who could not imagine why anyone would ever sing such a thing. They entered a place that had learned to be better by small increments. They were taught to be careful with words and generous with instruction. They carried that woman's lessons forward without banners and without the need for her to be in the front. The shot at 3,200 meters remained a hinge in their institutional memory. It was a proof that sometimes a single act of impeccable craft can unmake a culture of mockery and replace it with practice. History is an unruly thing. and stories tend to be told in various keys. If someone asked now what had happened the day the target fell, people told the story in factual but sometimes mythic language. They said that a woman who had been dismissed as just a carrier of a rifle had taken a single shot from a distance no one expected to be bridged, and that the target had fallen. They said that the battlefield, understood not as a single dirt plot but as the compound's culture, had frozen in stunned silence. They said that it had been a vindication. That was true, but it was also simple. The more accurate truth might be that a life of small practice had finally been allowed to speak, and when it did, the world had no counterargument that didn't look foolish. Under the name Meridian, under the touch of her hands, the rifle had carried stories of sacrifice and skill and the quiet knowledge that people can be wrong about others. The women and men who trained under her did not demand the headlines. They demanded work. They taught the next generation and watched as small changes accumulated into a slow but fundamental rewriting of a place's manners. Kersey learned humility the business way. Latham's petty power shrank. The coterie dissolved. And the woman, the hidden legend, the crate girl who carried a rifle like a history, persisted in being what she had always been. The quiet proof that patience and craft can become the kind of indication that, once given, remains. Her single shot had shattered doubts by simple arithmetic and the weight of professional fidelity. It had done more than make a target fall. It had made a culture listen. And in that listening, the compound and the people in it were slowly, insistently better than they had been before.